Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are going through carbohydrates. This is the second slide in the notes that we've been working on with the macromolecules. Macromolecules, of course, being those very large organic molecules that make up basically all living things. So our first macromolecule is the carbohydrate. The carbohydrate, of course, has carbon in it because, as we know, carbon is the center of all living things, at least here on planet Earth. Carbohydrates also are made up of hydrogen and oxygen. And you will hear me say CHO a lot because CHO, of course, stands for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Those are, of course, the three elements that make up all carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are compounds. And if you remember from when we did basic chemistry, compounds always exist in certain ratios. Now, most of the carbohydrates exist in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So what that means is for every one carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So in other words, if I had 7 carbons, I would have 14 hydrogens and 7 oxygens. If I had 20 carbons, I would have 40 hydrogens and 20 oxygens. So that's just the ratio in which they appear. Again, 99% of the time. What are the primary functions of carbohydrates? Why are they important for living things? Well, first of all, living things use carbohydrates as a main source of fast energy. What does that mean? That means that if you need energy quickly, you're going to get it from carbohydrates. If you consider the fact that many endurance athletes, marathon runners, long distance swimmers, things like that, do this thing called carb loading the night before a big event. So they have all that carbohydrate available to them to carry them through their event. The second thing that carbohydrates are used for, mostly in plants, use carbohydrates as a source of structure, okay? So structural purposes. So what do we mean by this? So if you remember from middle school science, we talked a lot about different types of cells. There was animal cells and there was plant cells. Well, one of the things that stands out and makes plant cells different is they have cell walls, and cell walls are very, very rigid, and they give plants their structure, much in the same way that skeletons give human beings their structure, right? It's sort of like the backbone, if you will, of the plant cell. And that is made up of cellulose, which is a form of carbohydrate. All right, so what are these carbohydrates? Remember we talked about, again, these macromolecules of carbohydrates are made up of smaller pieces called monomers. Well, the monomer for carbohydrate is the monosaccharide. And literally this means one sugar. The prefix mono meaning one, saccharide referring to sugar. And it's one simple ring of sugar, normally in a ring structure. Because again, carbon can make those cool little ring structures because it's little and it likes to bind to things. Examples of these monosaccharides, one or single sugars, we have glucose, is probably like, the one that we talk about the most in biology, galactose, and fructose, which I spelled wrong. That's okay. Okay, so I want you to take a notice real quick. The suffix on all of these, oses, glucose, galactose, fructose. Anytime you see a word ending in os, it means it is a sugar, which means it's a carbohydrate. That does not mean that every single carbohydrate ends in ose, but that does mean if it ends in ose, it is a carbohydrate. All right, so polymers. Polymers are, again, these chains of the monomers. The polymer for a macromolecule carbohydrate is a polysaccharide. And what this literally means is many sugars. So the prefix poly means many, and saccharide still means sugar. Okay, so you have many sugars, and we kind of know this because we know that a polymer is a chain of monomers. It's going to be many of these sugars. All right, so now we have starch, right? We could also have glycogen and cellulose. There's that ose again, right? So we have starch that doesn't end in ose, glycogen doesn't end in ose, but that cellulose, so that ose, OSE, is a clue, it's a context clue for us to know that it is indeed a carbohydrate. Okay. All right, so the two important ones listed here are glycogen and cellulose in terms of their polymers. Glycogen is a way that animals use to store excess sugars. So it's a way of storing energy, okay? Um, and cellulose, we already talked about this a little bit. It gives plants structure. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our slide again on carbohydrates, the first of the macromolecules. And again, feel free to pause and skip around this video as needed so that you can complete your notes. Have an excellent evening.